You Want to Be Rich was last week's sermon from the first 6 verses of James chapter 5. We're getting close to being finished with James now. There are only 5 chapters in his book, in his letter. And I was happy last week to be done with that sermon and that topic. But at the same time, I felt like I had left a little bit undealt with. If you notice, I didn't go through that passage verse by verse and never really got to the end of it. And then afterwards, my concerns were sort of fortified as 2 different people kind of had some similar feedback that I left a little bit undone there. So today we're going to move on, but first we're going to circle back to that bit from last week that I didn't finish up, from last week's passage and sermon, So You Want to Be Rich. Would you turn again to James chapter 5, verses 1 through 6, page 856. And we're going to be turning to a couple of places in our Bible today before we come back to this for the next passage. But James chapter 5, verses 1 through 6, page 856. One more time, I'm going to take a brief look at this. Okay, James chapter 5, beginning with verse 1. Now listen, you rich people. Weep and wail because of the misery that is coming upon you. Your wealth has rotted, and moths have eaten your clothes. Your gold and silver has corroded. Their corrosion will testify against you and eat your flesh like fire. You have hoarded wealth in the last days. Look, the wages you've failed to pay the workmen who mowed your fields are crying out against you. The cries of the harvesters have reached the ears of the Lord Almighty. You have lived on earth in luxury and self-indulgence. You have fattened yourselves in the day of slaughter. You have condemned and murdered innocent men who were not opposing you. Okay. So just a little review. So most commentators don't think James is referring here to Christian believers with these 6 verses. Okay? What this is very much a style of a style of addressing the believers as the Old Testament prophets often did. They would alternate between speaking directly to the people and then crying out judgment that would tend to, and then alternately crying out judgment that would apply to those on their way to hell. The prophet had those 2 sort of goals, that assignment, speaking to the world about judgment and speaking to the believers more specifically. And this carve out here, this passage, this 1 through 6, is more a sort of general to the entire world, calling out of the dangers of riches and those who pursue those, and the typical end of that pursuit. Last week we discussed how not every rich person will suffer this kind of judgment, and we had a few contemporary examples. Keith had one, the guy who started Harvester International, right? What was his name? Do you remember? Cyrus McCormick. And then we also had the man who ran, Chuck Colson's friend, the man who ran, Tom, help me out. Tom Phillips and Raytheon, right? I don't think I mentioned biblical examples last week, but there are several. A couple that came to mind as I was working on this is Job, for example. Hugely rich, also godly, walking with God. And James is going to mention Job in the verses we read next, and we will read those today. Also, King David, of course, became super wealthy, super rich. Joseph of Arimathea in the New Testament, another example of the godly rich. And there are others. There are exceptions to what James declares here. Proverbs is similar to that kind of claiming. The Proverbs claim how it usually is. Raise up a child in the way he should go, and when he is old, he will not depart from it. That's a generality. Like this is a generality, the danger of riches. This warning here by James is, I'm going to throw a modern metaphor in. This is a slippery slope warning. Right? Avoid the ice. When we get older, we get smarter about ice. But when we're younger, we can find it fun and fascinating. So maybe you remember being fascinated with a slippery slope and getting caught on it and find out how dangerous it is, right? Lose your footing once and you can end up completely at the bottom. Now, as an adult, I'm pretty familiar with slippery slopes because I like to ski. And I can negotiate slippery slopes when I have my skis on, typically, because the skis have very sharp edges that bite into the ice and keep me under control. But there are days and slopes where I shouldn't be on them because they're so icy that even with my skis, I might lose that edge and literally not stop until I reach the bottom of that slope. And it can be very, very dangerous. And the right thing to do, usually under those circumstances, is not go on that slope. Danger, that's the idea here. Danger, slippery slope. Riches will do this to you. Slippery slope, a bad ending, a tragic ending, and hell itself is at the bottom of this slippery slope that James warns against. You might be able to negotiate that slippery slope, but you'll be the exception. Very common scenario. The Bible warns us about riches over and over again. This is not the only place. It helps make sense, especially for a young man. I'm glad that whatever his name is over there, Naomi and Dave's son, Grady. That Grady is here. I remember when I was about his age, hearing sermon topics and taking note. Okay. Maybe I want to be careful about desiring riches in an unhealthy manner. That's typically what the Bible kind of teaches in a practical manner. It's for younger people who can make life decisions based on its wisdom. This is how it works. This is how it works over and over again. The Bible says, this is how it works. Be careful. Avoid this. Be careful here. Okay, so that's basically what we covered last week. But we didn't cover last week the final verse, which needs some explaining. And sorry about that, Grady. It's just what happens to me sometimes when I'm up here. You have condemned and murdered innocent men who were not opposing you. Wow. Verse 6. Never got to talk about that last week. You have condemned and murdered innocent men who were not opposing you. I said that a couple people made comments to me after last week's sermon, confirming that I hadn't quite dealt with it completely. Well, one of those comments came from an individual who found that last verse very confusing and very distracting. If I understood him right, he was saying that verse took away the credibility of the rest of the passage. And through the whole sermon, he was trying to appreciate what I was saying, but he couldn't get beyond. He was like, James has gone over the top. James, with that last verse, has made himself incredible as not credible. He took away from his credibility with that last verse. This guy was telling me, I believe. You have condemned and murdered innocent men who were not opposing you. This man told me, by the end of the sermon, he had come around, but almost the whole sermon, he couldn't get his head around that, and it was distracting, and it was taking away from the rest of what James had to say. Now, I didn't get to ask this guy this question, but for me, when I read that verse, a very helpful memory of a certain Old Testament passage comes to mind and immediately makes verse 6 quite credible. Let me read verse 6 again. You have condemned and murdered innocent men. Talking to rich people, you have condemned and murdered innocent men who were not opposing you. Now, I know this, and that is James' audience, if you remember, is an audience, this is an early letter, of converted Jews. Okay? They're converted to Christ. They know their Bibles very well. In that day and age, Jews knew their Bible very well. Some of them still know their Bible very well. And so what would come to their mind is the same passage I'm thinking about. And we have some people who know their Bibles very well here this morning. And I won't put you on the spot, but are you thinking, and I'm thinking about Susan and Lisa and Keith and some others, Tanya, I call these folks, I haven't used that name in a long time. I call them the Sanhedrin. Because they know their Bible so well, I'm always afraid they're going to be judging me. Oh, Joe, no, you got that all wrong. You got that passage wrong. And I love to debate that kind of thing with the Sanhedrin. But maybe there's a certain passage that comes to mind when you think about rich people who murdered an innocent man. One who was not opposing you. Okay. The passage I'm thinking, the innocent man's name is Naboth. The rich man's name is Ahab. And the rich man's wife's name is Jezebel. Oh, Jezebel. You mothers and fathers here this morning with daughters, in choosing a name for your daughter, did you ever consider the name Jezebel? I'm pretty sure you didn't. It kind of has a nice ring to it. But I know you didn't consider the name Jezebel. Well, we're going to see why that's the case. Would you turn to 1 Kings chapter 21? It's on page 257 in your Pew Bible, 257. And I'm going to read it out of the Pew Bible too. 257. Okay, we're going to read the first 20, I think it's the first 21 verses. 16 verses. Okay, before we read it, let me explain just a couple of things to you real brief here. The innocent man is Naboth, the contemning, murdering is the Ahab and Jezebel, and they are king and queen of the northern kingdom. Israel has split into two at this point, and many of the kings were quite evil, especially in the northern kingdom. Ahab was probably the worst. I think the Bible actually declares that he's the worst. And Jezebel was by far the worst. And so now let's read chapter 21, verses 1 through 16. Sometime later, there was an incident involving a vineyard belonging to Naboth the Jezreelite. The vineyard was in Jezreel, close to the palace of Ahab, king of Samaria. The northern kingdom is called Samaria because it's capital city. Ahab said to Naboth, "Let me have your vineyard to use for a vegetable garden, since it is close to my palace. In exchange, I will give you a better vineyard, or if you prefer, I will pay you whatever it is worth." But Naboth replied, "The Lord forbid that I should give you the inheritance of my fathers." So Ahab went home, sullen and angry because Naboth the Jezreelite had said, I will not give you the inheritance of my fathers. He lay on his bed sulking and refused to eat. His wife Jezebel came in and asked him, why are you so sullen? Why won't you eat? He answered her, because I said to Naboth the Jezreelite, sell me your vineyard, or if you prefer, I will give you another vineyard in its place. But he said, I will not give you my vineyard. Jezebel, his wife, said, is this how you act as king over Israel? Get up and eat. Cheer up. I'll get you the vineyard of Naboth the Jezreelite. So she wrote letters in Ahab's name, placed his seal on them, and sent them to the elders and nobles who lived in Naboth's city with him. In those letters she wrote, proclaim a day of fasting and seat Naboth in a prominent place among the people, but seat 2 scoundrels opposite him and have them testify that he has cursed both God and the king, then take him out and stone him to death. That was a stonable offense. So the elders and nobles who lived in Naboth's city did as Jezebel directed. In the letters she had written to them, they proclaimed a fast and seated Naboth in a prominent place among the people. Then 2 scoundrels came and sat opposite him and brought charges against Naboth before the people, saying, Naboth has cursed both God and the king. And so they took him outside the city and stoned him to death. Then they sent word to Jezebel, Naboth has been stoned to death. As soon as Jezebel heard that Naboth had been stoned to death, she said to Ahab, get up and take possession of the vineyard of Naboth the Jezreelite, for that he refused to sell you. He is no longer alive, but dead. When Ahab heard that Naboth was dead, he got up and went down to take possession of Naboth's vineyard. Yeah. Every original reader of James's letter would immediately remember this passage when James, condemning the rich in verse 6, writes, you have condemned and murdered innocent men who were not opposing you. It's a slippery slope. You begin to think you can do anything. James's original readers also knew the rest of the story, however, of Ahab and Jezebel. God saw to it that Ahab and Jezebel came to a bitter end. Ahab first, and his story is a little less spectacular than Jezebel's. Jezebel's end was particularly bad and gory. So let's read that. Would you turn a few pages ahead now to 267? 267. Chapter 9, beginning with verse 30, 267. You'll find it over on the right-hand lower corner where it says Jezebel killed. 267, lower right-hand corner of the right-hand page. Jezebel killed. There was a revolution in the land, and this Jehu was leading the revolution. Okay, so now we read, beginning with verse 30. Then Jehu went to Jezreel. When Jezebel heard about it, she painted her eyes, arranged her hair, and looked out of a window. As Jehu entered the gate, she asked, have you come in peace, Zimri, you murderer of your master? He looked up at the window and called out, who is on my side? Who? 2 or 3 eunuchs, they cared for the queen, looked down at him. Throw her down, Jehu said. So they threw her down, and some of her blood spattered the wall and the horses as they trampled her underfoot. Jehu went in and ate and drank. Take care of that cursed woman, he said, and bury her, for she was a king's daughter. But when they went out to bury her, they found nothing except her skull, her feet, and her hands. They went back and told Jehu, who said, this is the word of the Lord that he spoke through his servant Elijah the Tishbite. And this was a prophecy about Jezebel. On the plot of ground at Jezreel, Dogs will devour Jezebel's flesh. Jezebel's body will be like refuse on the ground in the plot at Jezreel, so that no one will be able to say, 'This is Jezebel.'" Ahab and Jezebel, their riches empowered and emboldened, their sin in life, and therefore added to their judgment in death. One more final reading of verses 1 through 6 in chapter 5 of James. "Now listen, you rich people. Weep and wail because of the misery that is coming upon you. Your wealth has rotted, and moths have eaten your clothes. Your gold and silver are corroded. Their corrosion will testify against you and eat your flesh like fire. You have hoarded wealth in the last days. Look, the wages you failed to pay the workmen who mowed your fields are crying out against you. The cries of the harvesters have reached the ears of the Lord Almighty. You have lived on earth in luxury and self-indulgence. You have fattened yourselves in the day of slaughter. You have condemned and murdered the innocent men who were not opposing you." Warning, flashing warning. Riches are a slippery slope. You probably want to avoid this slippery slope. What should also be instructive to us in this passage in James, and also what we just read from 1 Kings and 2 Kings, is that God is completely aware of who thinks they're getting away with this or that, and nobody in the end will get away with anything. That ending of Jezebel was real on this earth, but it was symbolic of her eternal judgment. Remember how just a few weeks ago, 4 weeks ago or so, we talked about different levels of reward in heaven and different levels of punishment in hell. Maybe there's some parts of hell that ain't too bad in comparison, but Jezebel's part in hell ain't too good. God's not going to let anybody get away with anything, and there will be justice. Those who deserve it will be punished more. Those who deserve a little less will be punished less. Those who deserve great reward will be rewarded greatly. Those who sort of, as 1 Corinthians says, just make it by the skin of our teeth will escape, but as a naked soul just escaping through the flames, and will be in heaven. God's not going to miss out on any aspect of judgment. None whatsoever. Okay, now, having tried to appreciate those 6 verses on judgment, we can now move on to, as James turns his attention away from the judgment of sinners to the wonderful future of those who have repented of their sin and received Jesus Christ for the forgiveness of their sin and his death on the cross. Now we're ready to move on to James chapter 5, verses 7 through 11, page 856, if you want to turn back to James. James chapter 5, verses 7 through 11, page 856. Okay, remember where we just came from. Remembering where we just came from, this next passage in James now flows like a healing balm to those who will heed the warning of the judgment of the rich. Verse 7, "Be patient then, brothers, until the Lord's coming. See how the farmer waits for the land to yield its valuable crop, and how patient he is for the autumn and spring rains. You too be patient and stand firm, because the Lord's coming is near. Don't grumble against each other, brothers, or you will be judged. The judge is standing at the door. Brothers, as an example of patience in the face of suffering, take the prophets who spoke in the name of the Lord. As you know, we consider blessed those who have persevered. You have heard of Job's perseverance and have seen what the Lord finally brought about. The Lord is full of compassion and mercy. And that's where we're stopping here today. The Lord is full of compassion and mercy. What will the Lord bring about? What will the Lord bring about when he returns? True riches. True riches. Lasting riches. Worthwhile riches to have pursued. Don't lay up for yourselves treasures where moth and rust corrupt. Lay up for yourselves treasures in heaven, where that can happen. Lasting riches. For those who will, as verse 7 says, be patient until the Lord's coming. Be patient until the Lord's coming. You want riches? Fine. Good. Just be smart about it and wait for the good stuff. Wait for the good stuff. The faithful will be rich when the Lord comes, when the Lord returns, because the Lord will bring the good stuff. The second part of verse 7, look at it if you still have your Bibles open. The second part of verse 7, the first verse in this new passage we're coming to today. See how the farmer waits for the land to yield its valuable crop. Valuable in comparison to what? The stuff he just talked about in the previous passage that's going to turn on you, that's going to rot and rust and turn on you in judgment if you have pursued it in an unrighteous manner with the rich, those who want to be rich. But if you wait for the Lord's return, just like the farmer who waits for the land to yield its valuable crop, and how patient he is for the autumn and spring rains. The best stuff comes for those who will wait on the Lord. If we were, some churches do handouts, and if there was a handout with this on it, these Bible verses on it, I'd say underline valuable in verse 7. What does that word valuable mean? How about this? The faithful who will wait for the Lord in his good timing will enjoy true riches. True riches that can't exist. They cannot exist in this earth, on this earth, this sinful, fallen earth. It's going to have to be recreated for riches that last. You know, this earth is going to go away, Peter says, with fire. Until that happens, whatever riches you're able to garner to yourself will fail until there's a new heaven and new earth, and then there will be riches that can last. Riches that won't corrupt us and add to our judgment in the end, but instead reward us for eternity. God will reward the faithful who understand the world's riches are deceptive and unfulfilling, and so they will instead wait on the Lord because they know he will bring the good stuff. This is faith. This is faith. You only do this if you have faith. This is a measure, a big measure of faith. If you can't think this way, if you don't think this way, that's not faith. That's not faith. This is faith. God will reward the faithful. Be patient then, brothers, until the Lord's coming. See how the farmer waits for the land to yield its valuable crop, and how patient he is for the autumn and spring rains. You too be patient and stand firm, because the Lord's coming is near. Don't just wait for the Lord. Do what is right While you're waiting, and that's the next verse, don't grumble against each other, brothers, or you will be judged. The judge is standing at the door. Remember when you were a little kid playing in your room with your friend or your brother or sister? Do you remember how you were sort of on your best behavior when mom or dad came and stood in the door? Watch over for a few minutes? The Lord is standing in the door all the time, watching over you. All the time. And one of these days, he's going to step through that door, and everything's going to change. Be on your best behavior. Don't grumble. Treat each other with love, respect. God is standing at the door. James goes further in describing faith. Sometimes it's not as simple as waiting on the Lord or just doing the right thing. Sometimes it's what God calls us to do, what will bring us suffering and persecution. Jesus said, "Blessed are those who are persecuted because of righteousness, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are you when people insult you, persecute you, and falsely say all kinds of evil against you because of me. Rejoice and be glad, because great is your reward in heaven. For in the same way they persecuted the prophets who were before you." Again, this is faith. James reminds us of what Jesus said and what I just read there. In verse 10, brothers, as an example of patience in the face of suffering, take the prophets who spoke in the name of the Lord. If you know your Bible as well as church history, you know that plenty of servants of God had to endure great suffering for their service to God. Today, May 7th, 2022, undoubtedly, there are some people in some churches that are suffering right now because of violent protesters who have been sicked on them. Right? Right now, today. James is saying, brothers, as an example of patience in the face of suffering, take the prophets. The prophets had to go through this, and you and I may have to go through it too. We want to keep praying for those who we know are going through it in some places. Sometimes people mention the persecuted church, for example. Moving on to verse 11. As you know, we consider blessed those who have persevered. You have heard of Job's perseverance and have seen what the Lord finally brought about. The Lord is full of compassion and mercy. You know, when Haddon Robinson teaches preaching at Gordon Conwell, he's passed away now, but when I was at seminary, he was, I felt like if I could just take his preaching class before he died, I would be happy. And I did get to take his preaching class before he died. He used to say, in modern day, you cannot use biblical illustrations and assume everybody knows what you're talking about. So James just mentioned Job, but there's some of you who don't realize what James is talking about. So I wouldn't just rattle off Job like James does here, but he's talking to good Jews who know their Bibles. Job was probably the richest man of his time. There's a whole book, 32 chapters or something of Job. And Job was a righteous, rich man. God allowed all of it to be taken from him. He remained faithful through all of it because he understood who God was and what the riches were. And so he remained faithful to God. And what happened to Job in the end? Twice as much, right? Twice as much. An example of persevering through hard times faithfully. God will reward you. God will reward you. God brings the good stuff to those who wait for it. James is just reminding his audience what they already know. The riches of this world won't satisfy because nothing in this world can satisfy. Wait on the Lord. Wait for the Lord, and there will be riches. The kind that won't turn on you. The kind that you can keep for all eternity. As you know, we consider blessed those who have persevered. You have heard of Job's perseverance and have seen what the Lord finally brought about. The Lord is full of compassion and mercy. Who is the Lord full of compassion and mercy towards? His own. His own. Adopted into his son through a relationship with Jesus Christ, adopted into his family, his own who will persevere to the end in faithfulness. That's what faith is, knowing he brings the good stuff.